we were telling Agile teams, be flexible, be agile, change, be open to change. And at the same time, we were imposing the project management iron triangle on them. Scope, schedule, and cost. You've got to be within 10% of scope, schedule, and cost, but we want you to be flexible and adaptive.
Jim Highsmith is one of my mentors in agility and leadership. His involvement in the formation of the Agile movement, along with his early authored books on adaptive software development and Agile project management, were foundational in my early transformation into more agile ways of working. One of the things I love most about Jim is his pragmatic approach. He stays clear of frameworks and processes and focuses instead on principles and practices that actually improve business performance and health. Jim's career has spanned over 60 years, including NASA working on the Apollo mission as an engineer, to project management, to advising for Qatar Consortium and ThoughtWorks, some of the early voices that I look to in the Agile movement. He co-authored the Agile Manifesto. He started and formed the Agile Leadership Network, and author of a half dozen books that span a quarter century. So when I say we have the expert in the intersection of agility and leadership, I hope you'll listen. I'm certainly excited to have a conversation with Jim, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Well, I just, kind of as a kickoff, I mean, you started your career when computers still required punch cards, I understand. And I'm curious kind of, just even in the formation of you coming, like that was probably pretty radical coming into a computer engineering discipline back in those days. How did that happen for you?
Well, it was interesting because when I was in undergraduate school, and I graduated in 1966 with an electrical engineering degree, and there was little, if no, computer stuff in the program that I was in during that period of time. I mean, we designed circuits with transistors the size of an end of a pencil, and the eraser on the end of a pencil. And today you get 5 billion on a chip. And so it's quite a bit different. And one of the things that, looking back, I think about is the fact that we did a lot of things from a programming standpoint back then to compensate for the fact that memory was so expensive and cycles were so costly. And so you really were at the mercy of, memory limitations and cycle limitations. And so you did things that were today look screwy, like two-digit year fields instead of four-digit year fields that yielded the Y2K problem. We weren't worried about Y2K back in 1970. We were worried about 2 digits.
Just pass that on to my generation,
That's right. Well, how many programmers today are looking forward to year 10,000?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, even going back, like, there's always a reason, like we think like, oh, why didn't you just think of that? Well, you did. You optimized to a different solution, to a different problem, right? You optimized to that space and the memory you had to deal with back in those. So from that time at NASA and Apollo to your influence in the Agile movement, I feel like I'm missing that little gap. And maybe as a summary, how did that gap occur for you, getting into being a formation member of the Agile Manifesto and writing some of your early books on Agile and adaptive software development?
Well, probably the main turning point in my career happened in about 1980. And I really got into the whole structured methods area. And then the case tool era where case tools became very prominent. They were sort of the first tools that supported software engineers. And then the 1990s, I really call the roots of Agile, because that's when a lot of the Agile people got started. So that's when Scrum got started. That's when XP got started. And I started working in the early 90s on a rapid application development approach.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of got me started. And I worked on several projects. I worked for one of the big computer companies, Amdahl at the time, that had a rapid development tool on the mainframe, and I engaged with their marketing people to build a short-term rapid application development experiment that we would take into clients, and we'd build an application in a month using 1-week iterations. And that was back in the early 90s. And so that's what got me started. And then in the later 90s, I ended up meeting Martin Fowler in New Zealand. We were both speaking down there. And then he introduced me to Kent Beck, and Kent Beck invited me to a meeting, and that which eventually ended up being the meeting for the Agile Manifesto. Yeah. So I came up through the structured methods rank. Kent Beck and Martin Fowler came up through the OO ranks, and we sort of met in the late 1990s.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think I was in a parallel world working on case tools, working on RAD and JAD and iterative development in the 90s, and then kind of jumping over into that Agile space. One of the things that I've always appreciated about you, Jim, is I feel like even early, you weren't as much about frameworks and process. You're about principles and practices of good software development, good project management, just improving work, right? And right. Culture and health and all those things. You've also tended to be on that side of, even as you switch from adaptive to agile, you always keep combining those two words. Agile, adaptive, adaptive, agile. I'm curious about that. Like, they seem like the same word, just different nuances. Why is it you keep connecting those two words?
Well, to cover all the bases, for one. and my first book was adaptive software development. Yep. And what adaptive brings to it for me is this sense of an underlying metaphor of complex adaptive systems, because I think software development is a complex adaptive system. And so that really is an important piece of the adaptive word for me that I started using many years ago. I wrote a book in 2014 or 12, something like that, called Adaptive Leadership, which was basically an ebook. So I've always sort of been associated with the word adaptive. And as I got to thinking about it, because I did want to combine them, agile to me evokes the outcome, kind of flexible, resilient kinds of things, whereas adaptive evokes for me a kind of a sense of an adaptive life cycle, of sensing where you are, acting on that, and then learning from the results and going back through that iterative circle. So the agile is sort of the outcome, and the adaptive is sort of the process, if you will. And I also want to use them together because agile by itself has kind of become so ubiquitous, and there's so many people that are for it and against it that I wanted to kind of stay away from that. So I didn't want to call it just agile leadership. So it kind of came to me to combine them. The other thing it does, which is kind of incidental in a way, is it has the same format as command control, command-control. And this is a juxtaposition to that. There's a lot of new management theories out there, servant leadership and more. And we haven't really settled on one term like they did on command control. And maybe we don't need to do that, but there's many different terms out there that evoke different kinds of things.
I really like your last point there, right? The command control has been a very, and certainly the Agile movement's picked up on that as the antithesis, right? In terms of, and so having a hyphenated word on the other side, right? Agile adaptive certainly kind of calls that out. Do you see this agile adaptive leadership as just, I get this question a lot. Is it different than just good leadership? How would you answer that question?
Well, that's a question I started asking myself as I finished up the book a couple of months ago and started looking at what I wanted to get into next. And so I got to reading a bunch about business agility, and this is how I ran across the Business Agility Institute, and we got connected. And so I kept reading this stuff on the business agility sites that to me just sounded like good management. And so I was wondering what the difference was. And at the same time, I just happened to pick up a book by Jenny Romedy, who was the former CEO of IBM for 8 years. Mm-hmm. And as I read about her journey trying to instill agile and design thinking into IBM, I began to say, here's a CEO that really understands agility. Whether they call it that or not, they probably don't, but really understands at a high level in the organization what that's all about. And so I really appreciated that. I think there are really three things that I talk about. Adventurous. One of the things that I talk about in the book a lot is
Hmm.
compare my mountain climbing adventures with software adventures, and some of the same kinds of things are involved, like prudent risk taking. Not wild ass risk taking, but something that's reasonable and is something that you've thought through and you understand the consequences. The second thing that I think an agile adaptive leader needs is to be inspiring. If you're going to change something, if you're going to change the culture, you're going to change your organization, you've got to engage and inspire the people around you. And so that's a really important point, is to be able to do that. Is that important for management in general? Yes, but I think it's more important in an organization where you're trying to change stuff. That's really important. And the final thing is to be adaptive, to have some sort of adaptive process that you go through yourself. One of the things that I'm talking about at a conference here in several weeks is applying the history to what's going to happen with AI and quantum computing. And what does history have to say about the evolution of other kinds of technologies? And I think so understanding part of the history of management helps today in sort of figuring out what's different and what's not different. I think a lot of it is a matter of emphasis, but again, I think it goes back to adventurous, inspiring, and adaptive are three components of agile adaptive that I think are important.
Yeah. Well, I think, what you're hitting on there is, yes, agile adaptive leadership is good leadership in a context of change. And there
Right.
might be good leadership in other contexts, but it's that change context, the complexity context, right? It's the
Right.
speed context. So yeah, I think what you're indicating is that adventure, the inspire, because of change, it's causing so much confusion. Without that clear direction, without that sort of bold step into that unknown, you're not going to be successful as a leader. I'm curious from you, like, it feels like to some degree our careers paralleled, time shifted a bit, right? Engineer to kind of project management, leadership consulting to leadership and organizational advisory. Um, I look at those three layers in the organization, right? The teams and engineering work that's going on, the project management and the portfolio management and all the program management that happens in the middle tier, and then the organizational tier, right? That disconnect between those three layers is something we often see. And I'm curious, is that something you've seen over the course of your career? Do you see that changing, or how are you seeing those three tiers and the way they work or don't in organizations?
I find those layers isolated from each other quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I went through the video, one of the introductory videos that you made about they're playing different games.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of those games that I ran into, in the mid 2000s, I kept running into it, is we were telling agile teams, be flexible, be agile, change, be open to change. And at the same time, we were imposing the project management iron triangle on them. Scope, schedule, and cost. You've got to be within 10% of the scope, schedule, and cost,
I
but
love
we want you to be flexible and adaptive.
it.
And so the measurement system and the management system and the engineering system were completely opposed to each other.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that led me to develop what I call the Agile Triangle, which was
Okay.
value, quality, and constraints. And the constraints are scope, schedule, and cost. And it doesn't mean that those are not important, but it means it constrains how you can deliver customer value. And if you use a triangle like that, it by its very nature tells you that there's going to be some alignment problems in there, and I'm going to help align management and a delivery team. I worked with a team in the early 2000s to deliver to a fixed date. And the way we did that is early on, we aligned between the development team and senior management what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and how they had to adapt as we went forward in order to meet that fixed date, that we might have to cut back some on the functionality, that we might have to do some other things, add some resources. but that we would meet that fixed date, and we did. And so I think it's that sort of alignment that has gotten out of whack in some places, and I think unfortunately it still is, because, and again, because if you view agility or agile as a engineering level discipline, which I think a lot of people did in the beginning, and unfortunately do now, it's not going to affect me as a manager. And one of the reasons I started the Agile Project Leadership Network in the 2004 and 5 was that I saw this disconnect happening, and I saw the Agile community basically saying, we don't need any damn project management, right? And we don't need any, in fact, in some
we don't want
instances,
management, we don't want project management,
that's
we
right.
don't want dates.
We just want
Yeah.
complete autonomy to do whatever we want to do, whenever we want to do it. And so
And it's no
what
wonder
I-
we
what
turn
I was-
off leaders with that message. Yeah.
Yeah, what I was talking about was we still needed project management, but we needed a different type of project management, and that in fact project management was going to help us bridge that gap between the engineering teams and the management team, and the project managers, the good ones, the ones that were agile and adaptive, would help us do that. So that was the message I was trying to get across.
So I want to just pull out the point you made on the iron triangle, because I think that's an important one that I think we've failed to learn. And what you said is the iron triangle of old, right? Time, budget, and scope, right? That's the traditional iron triangle. You've collapsed all those into a single point, constraints,
Right.
and added value and quality, which always should have been there in the first place. And so what you've done is you've created, what do you call this? The adaptive triangle, the agile triangle?
Agile triangle.
The agile triangle. I love it. I love that. Just the visualization of that, to me is really powerful. So with regard to leadership, so I feel like to some degree, we're not speaking to leaders properly on agility, right? You've mentioned we've talked tech agility, we talk frameworks, we have IT, right? Most leaders associate agile because of where it was born and where it grew up in software and technology as a solution to build products. Yet today we're seeing this transfer into business. What is it you think leaders need to hear, or what should we as you know, the people trying to promote agile ways of working in organizations, what is it we need to be saying to these leaders or connecting to these leaders on that brings this a little bit broader?
Well, I think to bring it a little bit broader, I use the term agility a lot as opposed to just agile. And it's, and so whenever when everybody asks me, what's the purpose of agility? Or what's the purpose of business agility or enterprise agility or any of the agilities? And when I read things from the Agile Business Consortium or even the Business Agility Institute, they're sort of long, well-worded, but unremarkable and unmemorable phrases. A set of organized capabilities, behaviors, and ways of working in business of freedom. You may have even been involved in writing this definition.
Blah,
I don't know.
blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
So to me,
bunch of platitudes.
I wanted a really succinct statement. So the purpose of agility is to help prepare for our turbulent future.
Business agility is to help prepare for our turbulent, I would even suggest present and future. Yes.
Well,
yeah.
future's tomorrow.
Yes.
But and you can substitute agility or business agility or enterprise agility, but it is to help us prepare for our turbulent future. And you don't have to say much about the turbulent future other than to look at, Maui and Florida and, the climate change aspect. We've just gone through a pandemic. We've got a war in Europe. There's a lot of factors that are huge factors in the world today. And so not only do I think agility is appropriate and helpful in a business context, I think it's appropriate in a wider context of needing more leaders in the world who are a little bit more adaptive and agile than some of the ones we see today. The other thing too, and I talked about this adaptive life cycle, I think there's a point in here that a lot of people miss as being the important part. And that is the front end of that life cycle, which is a sensing process. to sense what's going on out there in the world and synthesize it into what's important for you. There's so much out there, so much information, so many different things going on, that how you process that, how you sense what's going on, and how you react to that is really important.
I love how you're connecting into agility is as much about seeing as it is about acting, right? And we talk about that a lot. Like agility is often perceived as a movement, as a motion, as a decision, as a shift. But the problem with that is if we're not doing that with the sense, without sensing, we're
Right.
doing action for no purpose, right? And
Right.
it's that sensing that creates the smart movement. And that, to us, when we start teaching Agile, it's much about that awareness you're creating for the shift. That's critical.
Yeah, and I'll give you a concrete example of that at the team level. We're failing, I think, in a lot of situations to sense why we're doing something. What are the goals that we're really shooting for? I hear a lot of complaints these days about feature factories, about just churning out features because we want to get our velocity up, and without much attention to what are the product goals that we're trying to reach, what are the customer goals that we're trying to reach, what are the business benefits we're trying to gain, and so a lot of that gets lost. And so I think this setting the stage is an excuse me, an important piece that's getting lost a lot of times.
Yeah. So, with regard to agile adaptive leadership, are you seeing some success today? Where are you seeing success today in business or individual leaders that maybe you could point to?
Well, since I have retired a couple of years ago, and the last couple of years at ThoughtWorks, I didn't have much customer interaction. I was really working on a very specific digital transformation initiative inside the company. I haven't worked directly with too many organizations the last few years, but I have worked directly with a few people that I think kind of embody the good leadership. One of those is Jenny Romedy. As I said, I've only read her book. I've never met her, never talked to her. But if you read through her book, she's got some ideas that I think are really more agile and adaptive. For example, they knew where they wanted to go with this agile and design thinking. They knew that they had to move more heavily into AI and the cloud and a couple of other technologies. Where were they going to get the money to do that? So they had to make a decision to sell off a major part of their business, the manufacture of chips, that was part and parcel of IBM's history. But they had to free up that capital in order to fund these other initiatives. And I think sometimes people at the lower level don't appreciate what kind of decision those are. They're very difficult decisions because you're impacting a lot of people. But it's the kind of thing you've got to set yourself up to spend money for new things. So, for example, IBM put $5 billion into training for this new agile and design training or design thinking over a 5 or 10 year period. That's a lot of investment in turning the corner. So I really think she is one of the people that I would hold up. Somebody else is Heidi Musser. She was the CIO and VP at USAA for many years, and she's now retired and is the board chair of the Agile Alliance. So she really brought Agile into several organizations, but USAA was one of them that she worked with quite a bit. Somebody else that I know from many years ago is Jeff Smith, and he started doing a major transformation of Suncorp in Australia in the 2008-2009 area, and has been involved in several very large agile transitions since then, from a CEO and both a CEO and a CIO and a COO position. So he's somebody that's had a lot of experience. And one of the interesting things in talking to Jeff is he asks questions about things that few other CEOs are asking questions about. He really understands agility. He really understands the technology, like few CEOs I've ever had contact with. And so I think those are a couple of examples of people that I think kind of exude this agile adaptive leadership style.
Sounds like a few good people to bring on our podcast here. And love the fact that 2 out of 3 of those are female leaders too. So
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Well, one of the things you get from the female leaders is, if you look at performance, is the getting stuff done, and people as working empathetically with people. I think in general women are better at balancing those than we guys are. Performance and people, and sometimes those things get out of whack. And in some ways, I think the Agile movement may have gone so far in the area of self-organizing teams and autonomy and those kinds of things that we've lost sight of the fact that those teams also have to be accountable and aligned with management's needs. So I think you can go back and forth on those two things. But there was an article written, I think, somewhere by McKinsey recently that talked about the balance of those two things and how important it was to overall performance of the organization.
yeah, yeah. The study, I think it's Price. They did a research on performance and health. And the
Right.
companies that over-index on performance actually underperform the companies that index on health as a balance
Right.
to performance. We'll make a reference to that book in the notes. But yeah, that's the word language we tend to use: performance and health. How do you find that balance? I look at it as like an athlete. You've done a lot of adventurous things in your life. Performance is that one day thing. Like, can I perform this race or this mountain climb or this hike? Health is my ability to do that 10 years from today or 5 years from today or 2 weeks from now, right? It's that continuous performance over time. And I think a lot of organizations get so maniacal because of the speed of change, they just kind of zoom in on that performance element and kind of lose aspect of some of the health. Yeah. So just speaking of the Agile movement, we're seeing a lot of kind of what I would call kind of solutionism, right? Frameworks and tools and just taking things and trying to make them into recipes is the way I call it. I'm curious how you're seeing the Agile movement today.
Well, I think part of it is that the Agile movement has become so ubiquitous. Some studies have said that 75 or 80% of the companies in the world are using Agile. Now we know what that means, but for some companies that means
Yeah.
doesn't mean much. I always refer to Jerry Weinberg's law of raspberry jam. The wider you spread it, the thinner it gets.
Yeah.
And so out on the edges, it gets pretty thin in terms of the knowledge. I'm a part of a group that's just beginning to think about an idea we call rejuvenating Agile. And because there's a lot of stuff in the Agile movement that's really basic and really important, and we need to keep it. And there's some other things in the Agile movement that we really need to extend the basic values and principles of agility into some different areas. And so what do we keep and what do we extend? And what is it about the Agile movement as it got started that's still relevant today? And I think, people keep asking, are we going to rewrite the manifesto? No, we're not. It was a document at a particular place in time, a particular group of people. The Agile movement, which was kind of the light methodology movement at the time, is very, very tiny. And today it's huge. You'd never write a manifesto today that would please everybody. And I wouldn't want to.
The other word I picked up on is that word interdependence, right? Your declaration of interdependence. And that ties into your advice to leaders, right? It is so interdependent. There is no one leadership. There is no one leader. There is no one idea, right? It's how do you bring that system together in an effective, efficient way to solve problems, right? And that to me is the fundamental root of what we're working with today, is helping leaders navigate that complexity, that interdependence in our organizations and even cross-organizational, industry.
I remember a story. I was listening to a woman who was head of some educational organization. She was telling a story about being on an airplane, riding in first class, sitting beside this guy. And so they got to talking, and he said, "What is the one thing we could do with education that would improve it?" And she said, "Getting rid of the people who think there's one thing that will improve it." But I think you're right. It's not a singularity there. This type of leader or this type of person. If you look back, I did a Google search and I don't remember exactly what the number was, but there's something like 15,000 books on leadership that have been written, or probably more than that.
Oh yeah.
And so, am I going to read all 15,000 and extract, different leaders look at different things. And so you got to look at what as a leader, you got to look at those things that seem relevant to you.
Well, Jim, I really love the fact that you have not bowed out of this community and checked out. I love the fact that your voice is still being heard, that your messages are still being told, because I think you continue to add a value to our community today. And whether it's a revival, it's a going back to our roots. I think Alistair Coburn, has the heart of agility, right? I love his message around the heart and the values, right? I think there is some sense of it's spread too thin, and how do we bring back some of those core values? And so I'm appreciative of your voice and you joining and sharing with us today.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.